Hello and welcome to Reimagining Love. I'm Dr. Alexandra Solomon. Relationships have the power to wound us and the power to heal us. As a clinical psychologist, author, and professor at Northwestern University, I've devoted my life to studying intimate partnerships and family dynamics. On Reimagining Love, I'm here to translate complex clinical topics into tools and takeaways that you can use in your relationships today. If you're ready to develop relational self-awareness and create vibrant and loving relationships with the people who matter most to you, you've come to the right place. I'm so glad that you're here. Welcome back to Reimagining Love. Before we kick off today's episode, I want to talk to you a little bit about an upcoming episode that I'm working on. It's about dating again. Are you thinking about re-entering the dating world after a breakup or a divorce or another kind of loss? What are the questions that you have? What are the concerns or the worries that are coming up for you? Or if you're someone who has recently navigated this transition, what advice might you want to offer to a fellow Reimagining Love listener? I am all ears. So bring me all of your questions and ideas via the link that we use to submit listener questions. You can find that link in the show notes, or just email me directly at alexandra@dralexandrasolomon.com. That's DrAlexandraSolomon.com. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you. Okay, so today we're going to get a little bit spicy with an expansive conversation about sex, and I'm really excited to introduce you to today's guest, Nicoletta Heidegger. Nicoletta is a licensed marriage and family therapist and a sexologist who practices in Los Angeles, California. She specializes in trauma-informed sex therapy and equine assisted psychotherapy, which she practices from her unique ranch office in Los Angeles. Nicoletta also provides coaching, consulting, education, and retreats to folks all over the world. Her sex-positive approach aims to foster healthier sex, relationships, and lives for her clients. Nicoletta received her bachelor's in psychology from Stanford University, her master's in clinical psychology from Pepperdine University, and then her master's of education in human sexuality from Widener University. And when she's not seeing clients, Nicoletta is the host of Sluts and Scholars, a sex-positive, shame-free educational podcast that I really must say has one of my favorite podcast titles ever. In our conversation today, Nicoletta encourages us to get curious about how everyone can learn to have better sex. And together, we explore big questions like, does having good sex matter? Is it true that Gen Z is having less sex? And what do horses have to do with sex therapy? Now, I know that last one has you intrigued. Nicoletta brings her inclusive biopsychosocial lens to all of these topics and to today's listener question, which is about a missing sexual spark in an otherwise caring and enriching relationship. All of us are part of our culture's shifting attitudes about sex, and shame-free, sex-positive conversations like this one are an essential part of that shift. I hope that you find as many moments for reflection and curiosity as I did in this conversation. Enjoy. Nicoletta, thank you so much for joining me today.
So happy to be here with you. I have followed your work for a long time, and it's an honor to get to chat with you.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, before we dive into all things sex and sexuality and intimacy, I would love to ask you the relational self-awareness question that we ask all of our Reimagining Love guests. Are you ready for it?
Yes, please, shoot.
So what is a growing edge that you're currently working on in one of your important relationships? And what has it been teaching you lately?
I think my growing edge in my relationship, but just in my life in general, has to do with FOMO. In this culture, I think we're taught so much of like, there's a better option here, there's an upgrade here, there's that over there, and this sort of, romantic comedy approach as well. And so I really have a hard time figuring out like what is sort of good enough in what's going on and how to kind of embrace that versus thinking of like what's over here, what's over there, which is a little bit of my like ADHD, just sort of looking for other things going on. And so while I myself am also non-monogamous, so I am able to sort of look and have multiple connections, there still is that voice in the back of my head that says that there's some princess fantasy where there's one person who will meet all of my needs. And if I just look, they'll be out there. So trying not to get caught up in that, both in how I spend my day-to-day life and also in my relationship.
Okay, well, now you got me super curious about the intersection of non-monogamy and FOMO. That is fascinating that you're right, that you're speaking to. I love that. So we would never say that you are non-monogamous because you have FOMO. We would not need to connect dots in that way. But it's really interesting that for you, one of the ways in which non-monogamy perhaps serves you and serves how you orient to life in general is that it helps you kind of say, I don't have to do either or. I can continue to expand and try and reach and not worry about what I'm missing. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, exactly what you're saying. It's not limiting in the sense that I'm, like I said, thinking that one person is going to meet all of the needs that I have. And so I am able to form connections, with multiple people, with other folks, and still important to put in the effort into what I'm doing and making sure that I'm not spreading myself too thin physically, emotionally, spiritually, to ensure that I can really slow down and be present for myself and my partner.
So presence is an antidote to FOMO as well, because I struggle a lot. I definitely struggle with FOMO and thinking about, okay, what is everybody else doing or what should I be doing? And so you're also naming that one of your antidotes or one of the ways that you work with your FOMO is presence, to just be where you are.
Yeah, and really slowing down enough to actually listen to my body and get a little more embodied to make sure that I'm listening to what my body is needing and what I'm actually wanting to do versus what's coming from more of like a frenetic energy of missing out, or I'm going to miss this experience or that party or this thing, and really slowing down enough to listen to what my body is capable of, how much energy I actually have to give, and being more intentional about where I want to put that energy, because we're just constantly bombarded in life and on social media with like all the things happening everywhere. So it's easy to just get overwhelmed and overstimulated and inundated with all of that. But if I get quiet, slow down, minimize some of that exposure, I am able to see and recognize what I really want and listen to that sort of inner guiding voice. But sometimes I don't give myself the time to do that. And that's where I get into trouble.
Yeah, because that's not your default, at least not yet. But right, when you can remember, you are learning how to bring yourself back there. But it is a process of like losing it, coming back to it, losing it, coming back to it.
Yeah, because, there's so much information coming from outside. It's not in a vacuum. If it was in a vacuum and I was just at a silent meditation retreat for my whole life, certainly I could follow this concept. But with all the information coming in and all the options and people and just the challenge, I mean, you probably experienced this too. We're doing big things in our respective fields. And I think there's a lot of pressure to be the best, do the next best thing, do this, post here, do that. And how about this thing? Well, what about that? Oh, this person's doing that. Why am I not doing that? So that voice can get so loud, both in my relationships and just my life.
Well, you read my mind. That was the next thing I was going to say is I think part of it may be a bidirectional relationship. It may be that part of what appeals to me about this kind of work is that I have FOMO. So I am naturally already looking around everywhere to see what everybody else is doing. Anyways, that's sort of how I orient. So then to have a career where a lot of it is kind of strategy, visioning, iterating, creating, that it goes that way. But then also I think because, there is a way that, right, that part of this work is having a finger on the pulse of where the gaps are, what's needed, what's the next edge. And I think that for me sits very close and has a complicated relationship with FOMO, right? And am I creating from a place of scarcity? Am I creating from a place of, bounty and enoughness? I think that is definitely for anybody who's listening, who is entrepreneurial, who's kind of trying to figure out their space in whatever matrix they exist in. I think that is a tension of how do you watch and observe what's happening in the field around you so that you know where to plant yourself and where to build. And how do you do that from a place of like enoughness versus like scramble and hustle and FOMO?
Yeah. And I try to be kind to myself about it. And for listeners out there, and maybe you too, who also struggle with this, there is so much that we're taught in this sort of like capitalistic trauma, right? That we're always supposed to keep going, that it's never enough. We're always supposed to not celebrate what we do, look to the next thing, what's next, what's next. And so I think most of us are taught that it's not enough and we should keep seeking. And so we are sort of combating that ingrained messaging all the time.
Right. Versus creating from a place of rest and ease.
Right.
And
Right.
Yep. Yeah.
Sounds like we're on the same page.
Support group.
Yeah, seriously.
So Nicoletta, tell us a little bit about what drew you to your mission, which is helping people experience healthier and happier sex. How did you come to this work?
Yeah, so I, was lucky enough that I had some good caregiving in that sense where my parents were pro therapy growing up. I went to a therapist starting when I was a young adolescent, and that was really helpful for me. She was also someone who specialized in some sex and relationship work as well. And my parents were also pretty open in a lot of ways in talking about sex and relationships, and really not coming from a place of controlling my sexual and relational development. I mean, there were certainly boundaries and things we discussed, but they really encouraged me to explore that. So out of most of my friends, I was usually the person who wasn't shy talking about this. And while there's been moments of shame, of course, because I live in a body and in this culture, I experience, I think, a lot less of it than some of my friends and colleagues growing up. And I just saw the impact that it was having on a lot of folks in my space, and really wanting to help people overcome that and get to a place of experiencing more pleasure. My mission is really believing, and in a research-informed way, that pleasure and play are essential to our survival. They're, a human right in a lot of ways, and just essential for us being able to live and survive, not just something we get to have when we've accomplished all the things. And so in my personal and professional life, that's just become my reason for being.
Okay, well, so just a little pause here. Shout out to your parents. I suspect that I am much closer to your parents' age than I am to your age. And I think that your story is a story that I have heard so much with my younger colleagues who are not Gen X like myself. I think that there's something about the way that people my age-ish have committed ourselves to raising the next generation without having to unload all of the stuff that we grew up with, that I think is creating, I think the sexuality profession is just exploding. When I first started teaching graduate students at Northwestern in the early 2000s, I would maybe have one marriage and family therapy student who is maybe going to think about sex therapy. And now so many of them are going to go on to pursue specific, specialized certification and training in sexuality. I think that's so encouraging. And so I love that your story began with the fact that you grew up in a household where your sexuality, your interest in relationship was not shamed. And so in that way, your work then emerged from lessons that you got very young, that you actually, this is not shameful. And you probably weren't told this part explicitly, but you were it's so not shameful that I could actually build a career from this. And that's really a credit to your parents and the, sort of younger parents who are really committed to raising the next generation without shame.
Yeah. And I think the more I got into the field and the space, the more I saw how much it was needed, right? You're talking about marriage and family therapists. We had one short class in grad school that barely covered enough. And so, I wish there was more covered for mental health professionals and medical professionals. So where I turned when I was specializing in this starting in college, and I ended up working at the Sexual Health Resource Center when I was at Stanford and writing a sex column, and just the way people responded to what I was doing, I think just further egged me on, whether it was with resistance, where I'm okay, clearly this is important, or with, feeling like they could talk to somebody for the first time about this stuff. So both options really kept me at it. And my mom likes to tell me this story of when I was younger and I had figured out self-pleasure, as most young people do. And apparently one of my favorite options was the bedpost and the pole at the park. So I would be doing, I didn't know what it was.
Doing your
I
thing.
Yeah, I'm exercising. I had really ripped guns because I would exercise for many hours. And so I just remember my dad walked in one time with my mom and I was exercising, and my dad, kind of looked at my mom and was like, what do we do? Like kind of like not knowing.
He froze.
Yeah. And well, I didn't know I was doing anything wrong. So I'm just going, and my dad looks at my mom, what should we do? And she's like, oh, it's okay. She's almost done exxercising. Just let her finish.
Oh my Lord, let's just close the door, step
yeah,
away.
Exactly. So just as a little anecdote of how that permission can be given early on to body exploration to the young people that you're caregiving for.
Absolutely. And that was not, your mom was not condoning or encouraging, but she was not shaming, right? She was accepting this was part of normative development.
Yeah. Yeah. Just kind of neutral.
Yeah. What do you think helped her be in that place as she was raising you?
Oh gosh, I actually did a podcast episode on my podcast, Sluts and Scholars, where myself and my old co-host interviewed our moms. And so I think we have some info in there, but she didn't really get a lot of that necessarily. So I think a lot of it was kind of wanting to maybe do things a little bit differently in certain ways. And so just sort of forming her own path.
I love it. You just mentioned your podcast, which maybe has my favorite podcast title of all, Sluts and Scholars.
Thank you so much.
Fantastic.
Hard to advertise, but a good title.
I bet. You are like 200 plus episodes in on your show. So I would be curious for you to speak a little bit about how your views on sexuality have evolved or expanded since your launch of your show.
I'm constantly learning. That was one of the reasons I did the show, is I really wanted to, first I wanted to be able to reach an audience, to have a voice that could reach people who maybe couldn't see me in my therapy private practice, or to make it, the message accessible for people who weren't in therapy, couldn't afford therapy or whatever. And also, it was for selfish reasons as well, just for me to be able to learn and have social connections and talk about things that I wanted to talk about with people that I think are interesting in this space, that I want to share their work with other people. And so for me, I'm just constantly learning. And so I think it's just a reminder to stay curious and remember that I don't know everything. I may never know everything about myself, around sexuality, about a partner. And I'm constantly learning new things that I like. And it's just a great way to keep staying curious. I think I maybe always had that thought or that desire, but this has really just clarified that for me to keep a beginner's mind.
You are, in your role as host of your show, you are modeling what you want your audience really to take away, which is that beginner's mind and that curiosity. So the way you show up for your show is the way that you want your listeners to show up in their lives.
Yeah, exactly. In a curious, non-judgmental way, and accepting that there are so many ways to have sex, really broadening our definition of sex. And so yeah, I hope that that's something listeners will take away, but also just hoping that there's something there for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Why does good sex matter?
I mean, I guess it doesn't matter for everybody. And that's part of, to me, being sex positive, is that's okay. And I want that to come from a place for folks of like making an informed choice. I think a lot of people get there because they think maybe there's no other option, right? Either they like aren't sure why something's happening with their libido, or it's just not working in their relationship or with themselves. And so they just accept it. Not a fan of that. I'm a fan of like, if you look and see what are the options out there, like, am I asexual? Does my desire look differently? Like, what's going on? You know what? Sex actually isn't that important to me. Great. I'm glad you know that about yourself. But as long as that comes from a place of informed intentionality, then to me, that's what matters. But I would say it's important to me because I sort of see it as my life force in a lot of ways. I think it's my personal, it's my professional, it's what sort of drives me in creativity and motivation. It's a way that I've learned to really deepen my love and my relationship with myself. It's a way that as an adult, I get to play and explore and be creative. For me, it's just so foundational to who we are as people, even if you're not having it or it's not a thing that you care about. I at least want it to be something that people know about and talk about so they can make informed choices, because it is such a big part of our life and culture, even if you're not having it.
Yeah, beautiful. The way that you are reminding us that opting out, or taking a chapter or a season of pause around sexuality, that is exactly then what your journey is. But you are really diligent about wanting to make sure that people, that experience of opting out of sexuality really feels like a choice rather than a reaction to shame or fear or difficulty or confusion.
Yeah. And just the general like sexual health is health aspect. But yeah, I like what you said. I think there was a phrase I learned in undergrad in like a sociology class that was decide, don't slide.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. I don't know if you remember that, but it was around like research about moving in with a partner, but it was like, don't slide into something because it's just there and it's easy. Decide.
Decide, don't slide. It's Markman and Stanley.
Yeah. I love that you know that.
Those are the researchers. Howie Markman and Scott Stanley are researchers around, trajectories they do a ton of like premarital education. And that was what you're right. They would say, decide, don't slide. Don't move in together because somebody's lease is up. Don't move in together because it's just more convenient. Really make that choice with intention. And so you're saying that that's an idea that can be brought to all aspects of our relational lives, including our sexuality. Decide, don't slide.
And I get that that may not be accessible for everyone, socioeconomically and all those things.
Yes.
But, on things you can control, get all the information you can.
That's right. That's right. In researching you, we discovered that you are doing animal-assisted psychotherapy. Will you talk to us about that part of your work, of working on a ranch, working with animals? How does that intersection of animals and therapy go together for you?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So I do something called equine assisted psychotherapy. I also do equine assisted learning, which is basically, learning from animals more in the educational kind of coaching space. But it's basically working with equines, which is horses, donkeys, and the like, and having them be kind of a secondary therapist in the support space. When a lot of people hear that I do sex therapy and equine therapy, they're sort of like, what? They're not really sure.
It gets confusing.
Yes, they get a little, they get some kinky ideas just about what that means, but it's not like that. Basically, it is a type of experiential therapy where people get to learn their behavioral patterns in real time with the support of a non-judgmental entity. And horses are really cool for this because they are prey animals as we are predators. And so even though they're bigger than us and some people are afraid of them, the dynamic is different than people who do like therapy with dogs and things like that because it's a predator-prey relationship. And so the horses have to feel really safe with you. They have to really trust that your intentions are congruent with what you're saying, that what's going on the inside is the same as on the outside. They're really great at just being present, slowing down, taking care of their needs moment to moment. So there's a lot of things that we can learn from just being with them that is therapeutic. Like they're great at sort of co-regulating, meaning helping our nervous system match with theirs to kind of slow us down. So sometimes I work with them as just a resource and a tool for folks who are, working through trauma, anxiety, depression. Other times I work with them to help people model things in relationships that they're working on, like boundaries, space, communication techniques, nonverbal and verbal. And then sometimes we work with them in doing sort of guided exercises and activities. So two of my favorite that I do is there's a therapy approach called IFS, Internal Family Systems. And so sometimes we'll work with the horses in either somebody creating a space where they're sort of showcasing different parts of themselves, and then they're bringing in this non-judgmental creature to interact with those parts of themselves. And then we kind of see what comes up. And so instead of us just talking about it hypothetically or theoretically, we're working through it in real time. Or other times we'll assign those parts to different horses that they are working with that remind them of maybe a family member or that part of themselves. So we kind of can do some constellation work with that. Other times, just to show how it can work with sex and relationships, for example, if I have a couple that's struggling with their communication around sex and relationship, I will have them set up like an obstacle course, and they'll each have a horse partner with them or potentially one horse partner. And then their goal is to get the horse through the obstacle course without touching it, basically, like using energy, using intention. And what will happen is you will see the way that they interact outside of the therapy space. You will see what their strengths are. You will see who steps up. You will see who gets quiet. You will see who gets angry. You will see what they do when things are difficult. And so we're able to work through those things in real time as opposed to just hypothetical. So it's great for all kinds of things. And there is a big intersection with sex and relationships because we're talking about boundaries. We're talking about communication. We're talking about being able to be present. We're talking about slowing slowing down. We're talking about being sensual, and not in a sexual way with the horses, but sensual, like paying attention to your senses and what's happening moment to moment. So I have found it to be really cool and helpful for folks. So early COVID, I grew up riding horses and competing. And so I knew there were overlaps. And then I took some trainings and moved my office to a ranch.
Good for you. Good for you.
Thank you.
I know that equine assisted psychotherapy, it's not a brand new field, but as you talk it through, I hear and I feel the convergences around all of the stuff that's coming forward around just, embodiment and somatic therapy and understanding our nervous system so much more deeply. I can see how all those like streams kind of come together around equine assisted psychotherapy.
Yes, I would definitely put it into the category of somatic therapy and also play therapy. So I mostly work with adults, and a lot of kids do play therapy, working with dolls and toys and sand trays. But like now we're working with life-size horse dolls of sorts, even though but they have their own persona, right? And their own desires, and working in sort of a giant playground. So sometimes with clients, we just work on like playing and having fun again and learning how to play again. A lot of us have forgotten.
That's beautiful. So one of the things I've been really interested in lately is about how Gen Z is reimagining, sexual norms. These are the college students that I teach, and many of my therapy clients are parents of Gen Z. We know that the younger generations are having less sex than older generations. And even some data recently about wanting to have like less sexually charged content in media, more focus on platonic relationships and friendships in media. So some interesting kind of trends. We can never make sweeping statements about an entire generation, but how do you speak to, or what do you notice in your practice around how emerging adults are coming into their sexuality perhaps differently than older generations have?
Yeah, I mean, I have for a while sort of challenged the research you just mentioned about Gen Z having less sex potentially. And the reason I say that is I think a lot of times big news media outlets will like show the highlights of research.
Yeah.
And they don't often look at like, well, who's running this research? Like, what were the limitations? What was the I mean, you know some of this, right? Like, what was the reliability?
How do they ask about sex?
Exactly.
How are they asking the question about sex?
Exactly. How are they defining sex? And so I think potentially there might be less sex happening, but again, how are we defining it? And so what I see a lot for, I think, emerging adults is a potential more openness to like expand their definition. I think I just see expansion. I see a lot of expansion. And so I see expanding the definition of sex, being more open to the definition of sex. I see expanding the definitions of gender and the gender binary. I see expansions of what they wear and how they, present themselves. I see a lot of that. I think that's more of like maybe what I put into the category of like potentially positive things. But then I also see, I think on the dark side of things is, a lot of struggles with connection and relating to folks around loneliness, around body image issues that are happening because of like social media and just like all of the media output. And so I see a lot more comparison. I see a lot more people. We were talking about FOMO earlier. I see a lot more people comparing themselves to other people. Like, well, am I having enough sex? Am I doing it right? What am I supposed to look like for this? Oh, well, there's that. And that mixed with not having comprehensive sex education is, I think, a dangerous combination. So it's not necessarily just the fault of social media or porn or whatever. I think those can be scapegoats. It's like that we often don't give comprehensive sex ed to allow young people to look at things with a discerning lens, to make, again, those informed choices. So I see a lot of that as well as a struggle that people are facing. I also see a lot of stress and folks just kind of what I was describing earlier, not maybe creating enough time to really connect with self in a lot of ways. And just, again, doing that sort of comparison dance, which can really impact being present in sex. And now what's positive is there are so many sex education outlets online and people can get a lot of great information. But I also think as a young consumer, sometimes you don't know where to look. So it can be a little bit overwhelming, or you may get information that isn't what you're looking for. So it's out there and can be hard to sift through when you're already stressed.
That's right. All of the observations that you are highlighting very much fit with what I like see and feel and sense.
Is that what the parents are experiencing too?
Yeah. Yes. I think the parents who are able to kind of curiously engage and check in, right? I think oftentimes, and this is probably, we could probably go back multiple generations and see this, that oftentimes parents are sort of like rolling their eyes and shrugging their shoulders and saying, I don't understand my kid. So that's right. Not new. But I do think because there is so much like cracking and emergence that I think is so exciting and so complicated, I think there is like this generational divide can feel particularly intense. I think I've been teaching undergrads, that my undergraduate relationship and sexuality education class, we're now going to be the 24th year teaching it. So I, basically have this like living generational laboratory. And the way that my college students come in with a kind of language for themselves, a kind of understanding of themselves in nuanced ways, it is like leaps and bounds from where college students were 20 and 25 years ago. And so I have wondered if perhaps if this data is true, like that they are actually having less lived sexual experiences, if that is true, if we take that to be potentially true, could it be because that whole like dissection and exploration of who am I needs to happen before I know what do I want with you, right? Like, how do I know what to seek if my first order of business is figuring out where am I on the gender spectrum, on the sexuality spectrum? If there's a sort of sense like, I got to figure out my house before I invite you into my house, And if that's the case, then it's a longer on-ramp, but it is one that I think holds potential then for the experiences to be super intentional and conscious and aligned and full of lots of integrity. I figured out my sexuality by and large by just doing stuff. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think that I had a whole lot of thought about what, like that was it was the behavior that taught me about me. And I wonder if there's a way that the younger generation is maybe toggling back and forth, but doing a lot of self-work, having therapists from an early age and having access, like you're saying. And so maybe there's just more kind of marinating before experience, possibly. I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, that would make sense. I think it's so hard, though, to isolate the intersection of all these variables, right? Because I also see the impact, and this isn't new because this has been every generation, but the way the political and just the cultural climate is going to impact sex, right? In the 60s, 70s, maybe it was more free love and kind of against Vietnam War and things like that. And now we're seeing things around abortion rights, trans rights, social justice issues, toppling systemic isms. And so I also see that impacting the way people are approaching their sex and their bodies. And so it is impacting sexuality. So when I think about sex, I always use a biopsychosocial framework, meaning we're looking at the physical, the physiological, the biological, we're looking at the psychological, we're looking at the sociocultural, spiritual, and relational and community. And so all of these things are going to impact the way folks are showing up. So to me, it's this complex intersection, of all of these things happening that I think we have to take a look at. And maybe it started as one thing, but then some of the other biopsychosocial factors might be continuing or mitigating it. So it's complex. It's layered.
It's complex. It's layered. It's not well captured in a headline.
Right.
When you reverse Roe versus Wade, right? Like that has obviously massive, huge impacts, not just on sexual behavior, but just also just sense of self, right? Like how do you feel whole and sovereign, when the political atmosphere is saying that you don't deserve autonomy and control over your own body?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's also this interesting combination of, like I said, sort of the maybe negative comparison to all that's out there, but then there's also maybe positive community connection, at least in a digital space where people are like, oh, there's other people who experience this. So there's pros and cons to some of this new age connections.
100%. The last thing I'll say, and then I want to go on to our listener questions. This research that I had just seen about emerging adults wanting less sexual content and more content on friendships. I love that. I love, we have for a very long time centered intimate partnership as the top of the hierarchy of relationships. It is the relationship and everything else is secondary to it. And so I think one read of that data is that emerging adults are quote unquote prudish. I don't think that's the right read of the data. I think young adults are recognizing that they exist in a whole ecosystem, that yes, they may want intimate partnership, but they also want friendship. They also want family relationships. And so I think there's an interesting shift happening around what does community look like if intimate partnership isn't elevated above everything else? Because I know just years and years of being a couples therapist, I know that when I have a couple that is embedded in community, I feel like, oh, sweet. Okay. We're all like, it's not just the couple and me trying to figure this out. They've got people around them cheering for them. They're connected. Their eggs are not all in one basket.
Yeah, literally.
Yeah. Versus a couple maybe where there's not strong connections to community. Those couples have a much harder time. So I love if what the emerging adults are saying is, yeah, we would love to explore love and intimate partnership, but we also really want to explore friendship and family and neighborhood.
Yeah, I've sort of seen that for some folks, and this isn't what inspires everyone, but sort of be a direct challenge to, I guess, patriarchal systems, in the sense that like a relationship or a partner, especially for, the male-female heterosexual model, isn't what defines your worth anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so I see it as in sort of direct opposition to that, of like, there are so many other things besides, did you find the right partner, that can define a life worth living.
Beautiful. Okay, so let's move on to a listener question. Are you ready?
Yes. Got my therapy educator hat on.
Put it on. Put your hat on. We've got a really great question from Jen in Canada. She uses she, her pronouns. And Jen writes, I've been with my husband for 2 years. I love him deeply on so many levels, but the sexual desire just isn't there. I am 4 years sober and had a very promiscuous past. And to be honest, it was exciting and fun, albeit very unhealthy in many ways. He is my first ever sexual partner since getting sober. I'm not sure if it's my inhibitions / self-consciousness, not feeling desired, or the fact that we have been trying to get pregnant for a year with no success that is the issue. Probably a combination of it all. Regardless, I want to be intimate with him, but the spark just isn't there at all. I would so appreciate some guidance.
Oh, yeah.
All right, Nicoletta, I'm in it with you, but where do you want to start with Jen's really rich, really thoughtful, tender-hearted question?
Thank you, Jen, for your question. I mean, first, I want to normalize that this is probably the thing that I see most in my practice, right? Is couples who are sort of naming this spark thing. And that's sort of where my answer first wants to go, is like, how do we define spark, and kind of where did that narrative come from? I think a lot of us, when we think of spark, we think of the new relationship energy that may happen at the beginning of a relationship, or when the sex does have that aspect of maybe a little bit of uncertainty and danger. So it can be very exciting, but then it's also coupled with anxiety and that sort of like a little bit of a high feeling, and so it is certainly possible to establish and maintain connection long term, but it may not look like that sort of frenetic initial thing. All the things that Jen, that you listed, are certainly impactors that I think could be affecting things here, right? You said this is your first relationship since getting sober. And so it makes sense that you may need to start a little bit from the beginning of like, what does it take for me to establish intimacy? Some of my favorite things to explore here that I recommend to clients. One is to, and this is from a colleague, Dr. Jess O'Reilly. She talks about your core erotic feelings. This is basically, what is the feeling or sensation you need to feel before you're open to connecting in pleasure, right? Do you need to feel safe? Do you need to feel excited? Do you need to feel challenged? Do you need to feel sexy? So looking into that a little bit. My second suggestion, I always refer people to Emily Nagoski's book, Come As You Are, to help you figure out what your desire and arousal patterns are, because they may look different than what they were when you were single, when you were using, and when you weren't with this partner. So figuring out, do you have, I'm guessing you've talked about this on your show before, but spontaneous versus responsive desire is one aspect. I think some people are waiting for this spontaneous spark to happen, but that may not be how your sober body shows up erotically. You may need a lot of things to get that engine warm. You may need to be reading erotica. You may need to be giving yourself more time. Next question I have is, how is the sex that you're having? Most people don't want to have sex that isn't worth having. This is from Peggy Kleinplatz, another researcher. So, how do you feel about the sex you're having? Is it the way you want to be having sex? What would sex worth having look like? And then my final suggestion is to have you and your partner I don't love everything this company does, but the Sex, Love, and Goop special on Netflix, specifically featuring Miss Jaya's erotic blueprints, was really helpful. So check out Erotic Blueprints. It's kind of like what is your love language, but sexually, to see what your language is and what your partner's language is, because it could be that you're just trying to speak different languages and it's not happening. Lastly, always a big fan of the Esther Perel mating in captivity approach, which is sometimes the thing that we find sexy and exciting is not the thing that we're looking for to create safety in a long-lasting relationship. So there is this dance of figuring out, have I chosen a partner because we're actually sexually compatible, or have I chosen a partner for these other values? And now we're going to have to make a choice if we want to work hard at figuring out our sexual connection.
Great. What a comprehensive response.
That was my therapy approach in 5 minutes.
That was good. That was good. Jen really set us up well to take a biopsychosocial. You had mentioned that your lens around sexuality, as is mine, is biopsychosocial. And Jen is a natural biopsychosocial thinker, right? Because she's thinking about her sobriety. She's thinking about getting pregnant. She's thinking about kind of the establishment of this relationship and trying to figure out what is it. And she's not ever going to have the pie chart that shows the exact percentages of what's at the heart of this. And it is the intersection of all of these different elements for her that is shifting. And so I think in that shift, I imagine there's a measure of grieving that she will need to do, that there's grieving and kind of opening up. Okay, so I'm grieving that chapter of my sexuality that was alcohol fueled and kind of playing with all these edges and not fueled by safety, but fueled by danger,
excitement.
Excitement, not knowing. And that was a kind of excitement. And I don't know.
Yes.
I imagine that as she practices her sobriety, she's had really wonderful tools and supports along the way, but I don't know what kind of guidance or care she's gotten around the intersection of her sobriety and her sexuality. And I think that was part of what I really wanted us to drill down on, because I don't know how much that gets talked about when somebody recovers in that way. Of really, and you said it beautifully, you said she needs to start from the beginning of like really getting to know. It's like she has to get to know, and she gets to get to know who she is sexually when she's sober. She has opportunities to be in her body in ways she perhaps hasn't before. And for as promising as that is, it is also very likely pretty unsettling.
Yeah.
Just the sensory system alone, add in her thoughts, add in her emotions, all of that is different than the probably somewhat dissociated sexual experiences that she would have had, that any of us have when we're sexual and using, and so she really is like coming home to this body and maybe feeling somewhat disoriented at all of the inputs that are so different than when she was using and sexual.
Yeah. And the good news, Jen, is that you don't have to do this alone. If it's feasible for you, there are sex therapists, there are sex coaches, there are online programs, there are retreats to go to solo or together. Like there is a plethora of resources out there to not have to do this by yourself. And there is no shame in needing some support and accountability to learn this. Just like you learn to drive a car, you can learn to have better sex. And so don't assume it's just going to happen naturally because you love this person. There's going to have to be learning. So don't do it by yourself, and get some support so you can get there.
Great. Yeah. I also want to speak a little bit to Jen surfacing that she wonders a part of the loss of spark is around getting pregnant, their journey to becoming pregnant.
Oh, yeah. How stressful that is.
Yeah. I mean, she has spent a lifetime, and her husband probably also has spent a lifetime having sex be the end unto itself. And now sex is a means to an end, right? Sex is the means of getting to this baby that's very much wanted and being sought after. And so I would want her to just be able to make some space for that, just putting sex in a different category in her mind, plus all of what comes up. She used the word with no success. And so I'm really feeling like I want her to have time and space to explore whatever feelings of quote unquote failure are coming up for her, and what stories she has about herself and accomplishment and perfectionism and giving herself maybe a hard time, and therefore giving her body a hard time, even though they're only a year into this journey, and they are a year into this journey. It's like both at the very same time.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that. That's so crucial, because if people are feeling some kind of shame and judgment about the way their body is performing, quote unquote, or that's not doing what they want it to do, getting pregnant, right? It's going to be hard to maybe even love your body enough, maybe to be open to receiving pleasure, because you may not feel like it's worthy or deserving, or you're angry with it. So totally so glad you highlighted that, because having that relationship with yourself is going to be key. And that comes back to the core erotic themes here too, is that for me, the only kind of pressure I like in sex is if someone is like massaging my butt or spanking me. That's the only kind of pressure I like. But to have it be pressured in this way,
right,
that's not fun and pleasurable for most people. So yeah, getting some support around that, so key.
Yeah. At the very least, being able to talk. I want Jen to be able to talk to her husband about it, because I don't want Jen's head to fill with stories about, is he disappointed that it didn't happen this month? Or, I can imagine a world where she's protecting him, he's protecting her. Maybe it's hard to talk about. I'm thinking about if they are part of a community where there are other couples who are also on a journey to become pregnant. And then she's got, friends who are pregnant and she's not quite pregnant yet. Can she make space for both the joy for her friend and that like part of her that's like, oh, why her, not me? That sort of jealous part that then is she judging that part that feels envious and petty? And can she just make space for all of those parts, and that they all warrant compassion.
Yes. Oh, thank you for saying that.
All of these concerns make sense. And I think she's got a lot of awareness about what's going on. And that just like, right, there are probably these pivotal times in our life where we need to bring in more resources and more support. And so I'm so glad that you directed Jen to Emily Nagoski's work and Esther Perel's work and your podcast, right? I think sometimes one of the biggest things that sparks desire is just listening to somebody talk about sex, right? So what are the ways that she is letting herself kind of indulge in a, charged conversation? Like, I think that can also be something that can help her tap in as well.
Yeah, to make it fun again.
Mm-hmm. Right. You get to have fun even while you're making a baby.
Yeah.
But both and.
I mean, to be honest, it will probably, I can't say what's going on for you medically, but it will probably help baby making happen sooner, because when we're stressed, when our cortisol levels are high, we have research out there that shows how that can impact the ability to be able to get pregnant when you're in fight or flight, right? And so if you can have play and pleasure and have it be fun, that's better. It's a better option.
It's like we want to have the Jen from down the road who has the baby. We want that Jen to whisper in this Jen's ear and just be like, listen, the baby that's going to get made the moment it gets made is just exactly the baby you need. Like the exact month that those kids were conceived, it's like that was the moment that that particular egg and that particular sperm came together to create this human being. Like it's a freaking miracle that you can't understand now, but down the road when Goddess is willing, you've got, a baby, you'll be like, oh yeah, this is the baby that needed to get made. And the only time this baby could get made was that exact time that baby was made.
Yeah. If you are into the spiritual, a lot of my friends and colleagues really like the book Spirit Babies. It's a kind of mindfulness meditation and spiritual that is sort of connecting you to the soul, the spirit of the baby you're supposed to have kind of thing. So something to explore.
Bring in the woo. Yes,
yeah.
To bring in a little bit of woo. Nicoletta, it has been wonderful to spend this time with you. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you so much for having me.
For people who are just discovering you in this conversation, where can people go? Tell us what you have going on and how people can learn more about all your work.
Absolutely. So if you are interested in therapy, I do work with folks from California. That's because licensing things, you can only work with people in state. But I do coaching and education and consultation with folks around the world. You can find me on Instagram at Therapy with Nicoletta. If you'd like to listen to the podcast, which will hopefully feature Dr. Solomon at some point, Sluts and Scholars is my podcast on Instagram at Sluts and Scholars. You can also listen anywhere you get your podcasts or at slutsandscholars.com. And I do retreats and other things. So feel free to subscribe to my newsletter on my website. Last thing that is coming up in February is I'm going to be actually doing a live podcast event around maintaining great sex over time. It's called Afternoon Delight. It's happening February 10th in Los Angeles, but we will probably also have some online virtual options as well. So if you're wanting to come to LA, it's with myself, Dr. Tara from Love Bites, Dr. Nazanin Moali from Sexology Podcast, and August McLaughlin from Girl Boner Radio. And we're therapists, researchers, colleagues, educators. And yeah, we're featuring this event on some of our top learnings of maintaining great connection over time. So come check it out. Would love to see some of you there.
That's quite a lineup. I know 3 out of the 4 of you, and I think so well of August's work and Dr. Moali's work. Oh, that's so wonderful. That's great.
Yes. Come visit.
Good. I would love it. Well, thank you, Nicoletta.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicoletta, for joining me here on Reimagining Love. You can find links to Nicoletta's work, the Sluts and Scholars podcast, and the upcoming Afternoon Delight live podcast event in this episode's show notes. I also want to express my deepest gratitude to Jen for writing in with such an interesting, rich, and complex question. I'm wishing you all the best in your journey. Until next time, be well. Reimagining Love is produced and edited by Emily Reeves. Our theme music was composed by Slade Warnkin. Do you have a relationship question that you want answered on the show? Visit reimagininglove.com to send in a written or audio question. Questions can be about intimate partnerships, family relationships, friendships, you name it. If you're looking for more love and relationship content, you can find me on Instagram at dr.alexandra.solomon or visit my website, dralexandrasolomon.com, where you'll find my blog as well as the Intimate Relationships 101 e-course based off of the popular class I teach at Northwestern University. Thank you for listening and see you next week here on Reimagining Love.